I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. Never heard of today's mayhem, but it was a crime that was recommended to me, and that's my favorite kind. Sometimes as a true crime fan, I feel that I've read about, seen, or listened to them all, so it's nice sometimes to realize there's more crime out there. It's also nice to discover some crimes where nobody dies. I do try to cover at least one case per month that isn't murder related. You gotta lighten it up a bit, I guess. Today's margarita is inspired by the fruit that is most famous in Massachusetts, which is the state of today's crime. I did not know this, but cranberry farming actually began in Massachusetts on Cape Cod in the mid-1800s. They continue to grow excellent crops of these berries because of the environment that cranberries have to grow in, which is very specific. I think of all those ocean spray commercials with those guys standing in basically water. That's how cranberries have to grow. Massachusetts ranks second in the United States for production of cranberries, right after Wisconsin. They continue to grow an excellent crop of cranberries, primarily due to the wetlands they have there, because cranberries need a very specific environment to grow. I always think of those ocean spray commercials with those guys just standing in a sea of cranberries. For today's episode, we have another frozen one, folks, and man, it is a beauty. Can you see that? Ooh. We start with frozen cranberries. We add 3 parts cranberry juice, 1 part triple sec, 1 part simple syrup, and 1 part lime juice. And lastly, how can we forget the tequila? For this particular recipe, you need 3 parts tequila. It makes a deliciously tart margarita that goes really well with a sugar-rimmed glass. I'm starting to sound like I know what I'm talking about, aren't I? Well, I certainly do not know what I'm talking about, but let's get started. Okay, so full disclosure before we start. Netflix released a documentary series on April 7th about the Gardner heist. I promised that this was nothing but fortuitous timing. I actually plan my cases months in advance, and this episode will be filmed and uploaded well before April 7th even rolls around. But if I know anything about Netflix documentaries, I'm guessing this one is a very good one. It's called This Is a Robbery, the World's Biggest Art Heist. Definitely check it out and let me know what you think. And as usual, I have a book recommendation. There's actually a ton of good books out there, but the one that I sourced the most for this episode is this one. It's called The Gardner Heist by Ulrich Boser. He actually did a ton of detective work on his own trying to solve the heist. For this story, we're going to start a little bit further back in history with, if I do say so myself, a really badass lady. Isabella Stewart was born on April 14th, 1840 in New York City. Her parents were Adelia and David Stewart, and they were pretty wealthy. Her dad was a very prominent linen merchant. She grew up in Manhattan, spent some time as a teenager in Paris, and at one point was taken to Italy. When she returned home from Europe, she met a classmate's brother, a man named Jack Gardner, who was a very eligible Boston bachelor. They married in 1860 in Grace Church when Isabella was 20 and Jack was 23. They moved into a house at 152 Beacon Street in Boston. Jack and Isabella had a son who died in childhood, and then she suffered a miscarriage, after which doctors said that she would be unable to bear any more children. Around that same time, she lost her sister-in-law and a close friend, and she sunk into a deep depression. To help, they decided to travel. They were gone for nearly a year, and during that time, it really lifted Isabella out of her depression. Upon their return, she slid into the life that she was destined for. She became an enigmatic, wild, loud, boisterous socialite. Isabella demanded to be referred to only as Mrs. Gardner. So we shall. She preferred beer to drinking tea. She was often seen walking her pet lion, Rex, down the street on a leash. She gave lavish parties where she greeted her guests while seated up in a tree. In 1912, she showed up at the Boston Symphony wearing a headband embroidered "Oh, you Red Sox," to celebrate their championship win. She took 2 of her largest diamonds and had them set into gold wire so that she could wear them on her head like antennae. She was brash and extravagant. She commissioned a portrait of herself to be done by John Singer Sargent, who was the leading portrait maker of the day. She's depicted in a form-fitting, very low-cut black dress with pearls wrapped around her waist. Her husband Jack was scandalized and refused to let her display it in public. He said it was ungodly. She traveled the world, wearing designer dresses that were made to fit her form instead of with large hoops meant to hide it. She rode elephants, and she bought art. She bought a lot of art. Jack and Mrs. Gardner by this point realized that their house wasn't big enough to hold all of the art they had bought, which at this point included art by Rembrandt and Vermeer. Mrs. Gardner, in fact, was buying Vermeer before Vermeer was cool. She was a Vermeer hipster, so to speak. Jack died of a stroke at age 61, and within a few weeks of his death, Mrs. Gardner threw herself into her legacy. She bought land, hired an architect, and started work on what she would call Fenway Court, and what we would call the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. She was meticulous about every element of the building's construction. In fact, she went there every day, making orders, changing her mind, and generally, I'm assuming, making the contractors pull their own hair out. Legend has it that she brought a trumpeter to the work site with her and had different notes that the trumpet would play to signal the different contractors to come and talk to her. And it paid off. The building is magnificent and romantic. The building itself completely surrounds an inner courtyard that's covered in glass, the first of its kind in the United States. Mrs. Gardner moved into the 4th floor of the museum and charged admission, $1 to get in to view the masterpieces. That was about $25 in today's money. Quite a pricey afternoon. Oh, and she for sure hung that portrait that had embarrassed her husband in the Gothic room. It's surrounded by pieces made for an altar, stained glass, and other religious statuary. Take from that what you like. Isabella Stewart Gardner died on July 17, 1924, at the age of 84. In her will, Mrs. Gardner stipulated that nothing in the museum could ever be altered, including the locations of the artwork that she had painstakingly chosen over the course of an entire year. Nothing could be purchased, and nothing could be sold. This remained true for the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum for the next 66 years, until the late night after St. Patrick's Day in 1990. It is said by most art lovers that every piece of art is singular and unique. When it goes missing, it cannot be replaced. It is priceless, and everything left behind is just memories and inadequate copies. Lost art is lost forever. It took 81 minutes. In the early hours of Sunday, March 18th, a vehicle pulled up to the side door of the museum. At 1:24 a.m., 2 men dressed as police officers, right down to fake mustaches, rang the buzzer. They told the desk guard, Richard Abbott, that they were responding to a disturbance. Rick liked his job at the museum because, among other things, he could have this job while still maintaining his true passion, which was playing in his band. Rick liked this job because he could play a gig with his band until just before midnight, hop in a taxi, and make it to work. He was known to come to work drunk or stoned, although he does claim that he was neither stoned nor drunk on this particular night. However, he did buzz them in. This was a break in protocol because no one was to be let inside the museum at night for any reason. But it was St. Patrick's Day and they had that courtyard, and I guess it's possible someone could have gotten into it and I don't know, for whatever reason, he buzzed them in. There were 2 guards there that night, and once the officers made it inside, they asked Rick to step away from his security desk, which, by the way, was the second break-in protocol because that was the only way to alarm anyone in the outside world of what was happening inside the museum. They snagged Rick and the other guard. That other guard wasn't on regularly at night. I think it was his first or second night shift, and he'd actually brought his trombone that night because it was always so quiet in the museum that he just wanted to practice his trombone. Guess that didn't happen. So much for a nice, quiet, boring evening where you can play trombone. The thieves handcuffed Rick and the other guard and bound them with duct tape. They then took them into the basement and bound them with duct tape to a pipe downstairs. One of the thieves asks if the guards are uncomfortable and apologizes. And one of them buys a candy bar out of the vending machine and leaves the wrapper on the ground. Then they headed upstairs and got started. The museum was equipped with motion detectors, so we are able to know what rooms they entered. The only actual alarm, like I said, to the outside world was the room that Rick had been in, and so somehow the thieves knew that they were being left to their own devices to rob the museum at their leisure. Over the next hour and a half or so, the thieves stole art valued at as much as $500 million. The best-known works of art were stolen from the Dutch room. Using a box cutter or a razor blade, they cut from the frame 2 Rembrandts. The first was Christ in the Storm of Galilee, which is Rembrandt's only seascape, and A Lady and Gentleman in Black. They just left the frames just on the floor. They removed The Concert by Vermeer and Flink's Landscape with an Obelisk from their frames. They then grabbed an ancient Chinese gu or beaker from a table and took a small self-portrait etching of Rembrandt from the side of a cabinet. Then they went to the short gallery, which was on the same floor as the Dutch room. There, they took 5 drawings by Degas and a brass finial from a flag. Some believe they were actually trying to steal the flag. It was a Napoleonic flag, but they couldn't get it down, so they just nabbed the finial, which is like the top part, off of the flag. Chez Tortoni by Manet was taken from the Blue Room. The thieves departed at 2:45 a.m. after making not 1, but 2 trips to the car to put all of their art inside of it. The next shift of guards arrived later in the morning and realized that something was wrong when no one was there to buzz them in. They called the director of security, who had a key, so he arrived about 10 minutes later, opened the door, went in, and saw that there was no one at the guard desk, so he called the police. The police arrived at 8:15 a.m. and searched the whole building and ended up finding those 2 guards who were handcuffed and duct taped in the basement. Okay, so this case is unsolved. I think I said that earlier, but if I didn't, this is not going to be wrapped up with a nice, pretty bow. Think of it more like Christmas after all of the presents have been unwrapped. It's kind of a mess. And people have been trying to solve this case and obsessing over this case for 31 years. For what it's worth, I can see how people might become a little bit obsessed with solving this crime. There's intrigue, mystery, some pretty famous mob bosses, and frankly, quite a large reward on the line if you can return the art. But let's talk about that later. I'd also say that probably because of the reward, there's tons of bogus leads that the FBI is fielding constantly and has been fielding constantly since the crime occurred. Some of the early suspects in the crime were the 2 guards that were there, especially Rick Abbott, who had broken not 2, but actually 3 pretty important pieces of protocol. One was letting the police officers in, one was stepping away from the guard desk, and at one point during the evening, he had opened and closed a door, which had registered on those motion sensors, which he said he did all the time, but they thought that he might be signaling the thieves. The truth is, however, during that time, security guards were not really the priority in terms of spending for the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum and really for most museums, and so you kind of got what you paid for. The FBI did clear these 2 guys as suspects. This isn't the nicest thing, but the FBI agent who was overseeing the investigation at first, He said that those guards were too incompetent and foolish to have had any part in the crime. Oof. Famed mob boss Whitey Bulger was also a suspect for the crime for some time. He claimed to have no part in the heist, and in fact, he sent his agents out to try and figure out who did commit the crime because it happened on his turf, and he thought he should be paid a tribute. On a side note, Whitey Bulger has a pretty wild story on his own. He was a mob boss, a one-time FBI informant, and he was on the run for like over a decade. In fact, he was the second most wanted person on the FBI's most wanted list after Osama bin Laden for a while. He was on that list for a whopping 12 years before he was caught. But it doesn't really seem like the art heist should be added to his rap sheet. A really interesting story is the story of Brian McDevitt, who was a Boston con man who had attempted a very similar crime in the early 1980s. He tried to rob an art collection in New York State, and to do this, he dressed up as a FedEx driver. He also planned to steal a Rembrandt, and so these similarities piqued the interest of the FBI, and they did interview him in the 90s, but the fingerprints didn't match, he denied involvement, and he didn't really look like the two guys that had committed the crime. He ends up being discounted any further as a suspect. In 2015, the FBI did release the names of who they believe committed the actual robbery, those two fake cops. You know, the dudes with the fake mustaches. The names of the suspects were George Reisfelder and Lenny DiMuzio, both of whom died within a year of the art heist. George died of an overdose in July of 1991, although at least some investigators thought his death was a little suspicious. His brother told investigators later that he saw what he thought was that Monet painting hanging over his brother's bed for a while. Lenny was found dead in a car trunk in East Boston in late 1990. How mobster? But it's pretty clear that the two of them, while they may have carried out the actual crime, they were not working alone. Many people believe that David Turner, a Boston-based criminal, was involved in the heist. Probably not as one of the actual robbers, but as a middleman or someone who handled the art later. Later in the 1990s, David went to prison for attempted robbery of an armored car depot. At the time of his sentencing, David actually wrote a letter to the Boston Magazine about his potential role in the heist, saying, quote, "They thought that if I was facing serious charges, I would be motivated to help facilitate the return of the paintings. Well, they got the serious charges against me, and now I'm going to die in prison." End quote. George, Lenny, and David belonged to the crew of local crime boss Carmelo Merlino. The FBI was looking at Carmelo from pretty much the beginning. Carmelo opened an auto repair shop in the 1980s. This was after being paroled from prison after serving a sentence for robbing an armored car. It was in that garage that he did some deals that weren't car related, if you know what I mean. I think you get my drift. He did a variety of stints in jail and actually was sent to prison for the same incident as David Turner, the attempted robbery of that armored car depot. Turns out he was also unable or unwilling to use the artwork to broker a lighter sentence. He died in federal prison in 2005. Oof, and that's not even it. But listen, the FBI released who they believe did the crime in 2015. A couple of dead guys. So, knowing the criminals doesn't really solve the crime, does it? We can't really say a motive because the art hasn't even resurfaced. If you want my opinion, I don't think Carmelo Merlino or David Turner were involved in this crime, unless the art never actually made it to them. Why wouldn't they use it to get out of prison? Art thefts were pretty common and are still pretty common because in a lot of cases, criminals can use art as a sort of get out of jail free card. But they didn't play that card. That just doesn't make sense to me. And maybe it was Lenny and George who broke into the museum that night, or maybe not. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who did it. What matters is where the art is. I think there's two possible scenarios here. The first is that the art is tucked away, hidden somewhere, and whoever knew where it was hidden is dead. The other possibility is that the art was accidentally destroyed. I don't think it was destroyed on purpose. It was too valuable. It had to be an accident. Remember, the two guys who stole the paintings weren't exactly gentle with them. They ripped them out of the frames. They cut them out of the frames. These pieces of art were hundreds of years old. They were incredibly fragile and delicate. There is this legend, this story about one of the guys connected to the crime. Could have been one of the ones I talked about or another one. I don't know. There's a lot of people connected to this crime who had sort of a hidden cellar somewhere in Boston. That cellar flooded, and the guy's son remembers him being pretty unreasonably upset about whatever was lost or destroyed in that cellar. It's possible that the art was in there. Who knows? And if they're in some attic in Boston, the temperature differentials and the changes in humidity are pretty much destroying those masterpieces the longer they stay there. So if they haven't already been destroyed, let's hope they get found soon. The case of the art heist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum remains an open investigation. It is said that stolen art is either recovered immediately or in the next generation, when a child or a grandchild discovers a piece of art tucked away in an attic or a basement. It's been 31 years, and that's about time for a discovery in the second category. The statute of limitations passed long ago on this crime, so people can't be prosecuted for it, but they can be rewarded handsomely. The museum continues to offer a reward of $10 million for all 13 pieces of art to be returned in good condition. The little finial from the flag has its own $100,000 reward. There have been some changes to laws due in part to this art heist, including one part of the theft of major artwork law. This makes it a federal crime to steal, receive, or handle a piece of cultural heritage that is worth more than $100,000. This means that anyone today who handles one of these masterpieces could be charged under that law. So what do you think? Are you as confused as I am by people who steal art? It just doesn't make any sense to me. What are you going to do with it? Display it in your bedroom? Well, I guess that guy did. Who are you going to sell it to? It's not like they can actually display it. And seriously, this wasn't that long ago. How does something happen like this in a day and age with cameras and security footage and nobody caught it? How did it take them 25 years to release the identities of their primary suspects? Do you think there was a mob connection, or is it somebody else entirely? And where the heck is all that art? And I'm sorry, but we gotta talk about that amazing woman, Isabella Stewart Gardner, for a second, who just walks around with their pet lion on a leash. Do you think she was a woman ahead of her time, or just a little bit eccentric? And what do you think she would think about the heist and her missing pieces of art? Experts say that art theft is common because it's easy. Many art museums believe that they're safe from theft because of the art mystique. And that's just not true. If there were a museum filled with the world's stolen artwork, it would be the most impressive museum in the world. There would be artwork by Van Gogh and Picasso and Rembrandt and Vermeer, and there would be much, much more. Experts call it the Lost Museum. At the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the frames that were left strewn about the floor were picked up and rehung on the wall. They remain in the exact spots that Mrs. Gardner wanted them, as placeholders for the missing pieces of art and as hope for their return. Remember, it was Mrs. Gardner's dying wish that her collection remain exactly as she had designed it. We can only hope that her wish becomes a reality once more. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you have an idea for a case, or more importantly, a margarita, come hang out with us on social media. The links are in the description box. Okay, so you've gotten a little bit of a break with the murder over the last 2 weeks, so next week we're going back to murder. Belle Gunness. This absolutely wild story of a female serial killer and arsonist who, I'm just gonna say it, basically, definitely, probably 100% got away with it. And we will be refreshing our taste buds with a margarita that is reminiscent of summer days on the farm. Or one of my favorite candy flavors, watermelon. Don't forget to go shopping this weekend for your margarita ingredients for next week. They're also in the description box. Help me out by liking, subscribing, reviewing, and all the things you can think of to do. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murder and stealing priceless art.